This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken from K-State begin today's show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode where they conversed about a rare case of rabies. K-State veterinarian Gregg Hanzlicek keeps the show rolling as he breaks down the common causes of abortions in cattle from his 2025 lab data. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show saying dairy herds increased in size in 2025, but the total number of dairy farms decreased, something he expects to continue in 2026. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. And Drew, you have some maybe a little morbid discussion today, I guess, but we're going to talk about a terrestrial episode. So what do you have for us today?
Well, you know, a few episodes ago, we talked about some wildlife disease stuff, zoonotic diseases. Since then, there have been a couple of headline-making reports that have come out of the CDC about rabies. And, you know, the main reservoirs for rabies in most countries are wildlife. And I figured that gives us an opportunity to kind of talk about a little bit of human-wildlife conflict associated with disease. Wanted to bring those up since they've been big headlines recently.
You know, one case that I recently read about, and I think that comes to mind, was a transplant. I think it was a kidney that happened. I think it happened last year, but the news just came out about that. So are you familiar with that case at all?
Yeah, that's one of them that I saw. And so that occurred about almost exactly a year ago. So it was December of 2024. But when the CDC investigates these things, of course, it takes some time, and they want to be accurate with their report of the investigation. So about a year since that happened. But in Michigan, December 2024, a man died after receiving a kidney transplant, and he died about 6 weeks after he received that kidney transplant. And they did an investigation, and they found out that the donor of that kidney was an Idaho man who had been exposed to a skunk about 6 weeks before he developed symptoms and then died, and that skunk exposure was not picked up by the initial screening that's done, the risk assessment that's done of donors to try and make sure that it's not a high-risk donor. And one of the other things that I learned when I was reading about this, doing a little bit of research about it, is that rabies is so uncommon in humans in North America that that's not one of the diseases that is screened for when they're checking for diseases to make sure that an organ is safe, or that somebody is safe to be a donor. So
how did they figure out that the donor was the case? Do you know anything about that, or how he got the rabies in the first place?
Yeah, so, I think that they identified rabies in the person that got the kidney transplant, and they started trying to figure out how they got it.
Yep.
But then when they started doing that backtracking, they learned from family members and an additional interview of family members that about 6 weeks before this person became ill and was admitted to the hospital, they were in an outbuilding and they were holding a kitten, and a skunk acted really aggressive. It came at them, and the person actually had to fight off the skunk, and they attributed that to the fact that they were holding a kitten, and so they didn't think much about it. But the person was actually bitten by the skunk on the leg when they were fighting that skunk off, but never was tested for rabies. And when they started looking at the symptoms that the person was admitted to the hospital for, unfortunately, they were really classic rabies symptoms that weren't caught. So some of the things that we see from rabies are inability to swallow or difficulty swallowing, of course, really high fever, but the person was having trouble walking, which is another classic symptom of rabies. They were having hallucinations, which is a symptom of encephalitis, which is swelling of the brain, and that could be also associated with the really high fever. So the other thing that was interesting to me that they found when they were doing that report was they can use genetic evidence from the viral particles that they isolate in an infection to figure out how the skunk got it. So
cool.
Where we live in the Great Plains, skunks are the primary reservoir for rabies. But in Idaho, it's actually bats. Rabies in skunks there is less common. And they traced it back to a silver-haired bat, which is a bat species we have in Kansas. But that was the species of bat that infected the skunk, and then the skunk infected the man who was a donor, and then the kidney transplant recipient got it from the kidney. There were also 3 people who received cornea graft transplants from that same donor. And once the man with the kidney transplant became ill, they started doing this investigation and rapidly found those folks, and they removed those grafted corneas from them, and I think probably treated them with post-exposure rabies prophylaxis too, which would be those shots that we hear about. That's one thing that's probably interesting to talk about. When you're exposed to rabies without treatment, it's 100% fatal if you start to develop symptoms. And a lot of times people are scared of that post-exposure treatment because at one time, it was shots in the belly button. It's not shots in the belly button anymore. It's regular old shots, and it's very similar to the pre-exposure shots, which I've had. I also had post-exposure shots too, but that's a kind of a crazy story.
Are you familiar with how common organ transplant donor gets rabies? It has to be something, I would imagine, doesn't happen all the time, or they'd be testing for it fairly often.
Yeah. So it's incredibly rare. There's been 4 cases that have been documented by, our health service, the CDC in the United States since 1978. And there's been a lot of transplants of organs during that time period. So this case is going to cause them to sort of reassess their screening process, and rabies will likely be something that they will be looking for more as a risk of donating organs and that sort of thing. And so when these rare things happen, they do trigger an assessment of what we're doing. And so if you are someone or know someone or love someone who is a potential donor recipient, please don't think that this is something that should cause you to be scared of that, but it is something that we need to pay attention to.
If it's going to be fatal, can you do anything about it?
Yeah, so there's a window between being exposed and developing symptoms. And during that window is when you need to get treated. If you are attacked, if you are bitten by a wildlife species, then you should go see a doctor. You should undergo a risk assessment to decide if you need to have that post-exposure prophylaxis. I guess the bad thing about rabies vaccination for humans is the vaccine it doesn't 100% prevent you from getting the disease. So it's not like I'm vaccinated, it doesn't matter if I get bit.
Sure.
But it extends that window between when you get bit and when you might get sick, so that you have a longer period of time when you can get that post-exposure treatment. So if you have that kind of interaction with an animal, if you are able to collect that animal, euthanize it, I guess, is a better way of thinking about this, because we're not going to try and live capture that animal probably. But if you can euthanize it, don't destroy the brain, because that's how they're going to test the animal that you catch or that you were exposed to for rabies. So if it is rabid, then you can be treated, but you don't have to be treated if it wasn't rabid.
What can we do to help reduce our risk of rabies then?
Sure. So if you're specifically thinking about bats, we really don't want to have a bat colony in a house if we can avoid that. Bat conservation is very important. And, bats are very important for lots of different reasons, but living in your home is not something that you should have to allow to happen just because they're an important species ecologically. And so just evicting bats from homes, there's a process that you would follow for that. Really, the best thing for most people is to reach out to a wildlife management professional, and they, during the appropriate times of the year when there aren't pups up in the attic that can't fly, then they would put bat excluders on the home, and the bats fly out, but they can't get back in. And then once the bats have been out of the home or are completely out of the home, then they'll seal it up, take those bat excluders down, and do some remediation potentially if there's a bunch of guano up there and that sort of thing. The other critters that are likely to expose us or that are likely to have rabies, like skunks and raccoons, foxes, these are all animals that we can really limit our interaction with them through a lot of different ways. If we're thinking about habitat modification, removing food sources that might attract them. Other things from a habitat modification standpoint that are sort of a hybrid between habitat modification and exclusion are thinking about like where skunks like to den. So sheds that are up on skids are a really common place that they'll den under, buildings with open crawl spaces, that sort of thing. If you've got brush piles around the yard, that's good habitat for skunks. Any sort of brush pile of sticks, even if it doesn't look like a big enough pile of sticks for a skunk to stay in, all those sorts of things are homes for these kind of critters. So limiting that. One of the habitat modification things that I didn't say is not feeding pets free choice. That's a really good way to expose a potentially unvaccinated pet, to a critter that might have rabies and bring it back to you. And then, when we do have skunks around a farmstead or around a home, or raccoons, potentially trapping them and then euthanizing them. We sure don't want to move them around, especially when we're thinking about rabies and other diseases and stuff.
Once again, that was Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. You can hear the full episode by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform or by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing 2025 bovine abortion causes with veterinarian in K-State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Gregg, as we're going to talk through this data for bovine abortions, what point in the cow's gestation are we looking at?
When we're talking about diagnostics and working up abortion workups, it's typically cases where in their last 3 months of the last trimester of pregnancy.
With that, sometimes, do you know if it's actually an abortion or just maybe a stillborn calf?
Yeah, so it's kind of a fine line when the calves get very, very close to when they're supposed to be born. We kind of lump everything together, but some of those are probably what we call stillborns, meaning it's not really abortion. The calf was supposed to be delivered at this time, and unfortunately it's not alive when it's born. So some of these that we do work up, we do know that they are actually stillborn. Sometimes the producer does not know. So,
and thinking about this data, what did you see as some major causes of abortion?
Yeah, so we summarize this every year. We're looking for trends, and so we finished up 2025 just this last week, and the number one cause in 2025 was a mixture of bacteria, meaning there wasn't, other than lepto, the other bacteria that were involved were just a whole different range of bacteria that are present in the environment in every operation, and why they cause abortions on certain operations, and we don't typically look at it as an epidemic of abortion, but maybe one or two here and there. So just a whole range of E. coli, bacillus, some other bacteria that actually were the number one cause of abortion that we found through the diagnostic lab.
And breaking down the bacteria a little bit more, you mentioned lepto, and what are some other of those top bacteria you saw causing issues?
Well, lepto's number one, and it continues. Last year, it was about 5% of the abortions we worked up and got a diagnosis were due to lepto. through the years, if you look at our data, it goes all the way up. There's some years where it goes up to 10%. So even though most producers do vaccinate against lepto, we know that the lepto vaccines for the most part are not super effective for protection, and it just continues to be a concern.
And what about Neospora?
Neospora it's a protozoa, so think of it more like a crypto or coccidia, but it was the second most common, what we called cause of abortions last year in our diagnostic lab. But I won't get into this. We probably ought to have a separate talk about it later, but I do think it's overdiagnosed, but it is out there. We know it's in our beef and dairy herds, and it does and can cause abortions. And unfortunately, this year was the second most common diagnosis that we had.
And beforehand, you also mentioned IBR and being able to test to see where that's coming from to cause that abortion potentially.
Yeah, IBR last year was about 18% of the cases that we diagnosed. Actually, we found IBR virus in either the fetus or the placenta. And we do know that modified live IBR vaccines, if the label is not followed appropriately, that it can cause abortions in pregnant cows. And so when we have an IBR positive fetus here, we offer a service that I'm not sure any other lab can, but what we do is we genetically sequence that virus in the fetus, and then we've got a library of all the IBR vaccine strains out there, and we can compare the fetal strain to the vaccine strain, and we can come up with an answer saying, is this vaccine strain we're finding in the fetus, or is it actually exposure to a field strain of IBR? And that's an important question to answer in a lot of cases. And again, lots of vaccines are labeled to use these products in pregnant animals, but it's really important that producers follow the labeled directions before they use these modified lives in pregnant animals.
What mistake do you often see producers, when we're thinking about that label, accidentally scan over or miss?
Yeah, for a lot of our cases are cows with an unknown vaccination history. And then a modified live vaccine is used on them, and then within 4 to about 10 days, typically, we'll have an abortion storm. And every one of these products that's labeled for use in pregnant animals, that animal has to have been vaccinated within the previous 12 months with the same product or a product that's on the label. And if they're not, then the producer is putting these animals at risk to have an IBR-induced abortion.
And at the end of last year on Ag Today, we talked quite a bit about vitamins and what the cattle were needing. And do you see that as a lack of vitamins being one of the causes of abortion for 2025?
Yes, vitamin E was number 4 and vitamin A was number 6 reason. And we continue to have issues. About 12% of our abortion workups were either vitamin E or vitamin A associated. So we do continually have issues with both, probably more vitamin A than vitamin E issues, but nutrition is so important to maintain these pregnancies and make sure these calves are viable when they hit the ground, and a little more concentration on protein, energy, trace minerals, but especially vitamins, I think is something we probably ought to be looking for and pushing in the future.
Did you see another key data point when it came to summarizing all this data?
Well, there's always one, and it's never at the top, but it's up there high enough that I think producers should be aware of it. And it's fungus or mold, and it's coming, from the environmental, typically from the forages that the animals are consuming. And we do know that fungus abortion typically occurs because the dam inhales the mold. It doesn't necessarily eat the mold, but it inhales the mold. The mold gets into the lungs, and then it becomes into the bloodstream and goes to the calf. So one of the samples that we always want for an abortion workup is the fluid that's in the calf's abomasum. That's where we're going to find the mold or the fungi. So that's an important sample to submit to us when you're trying to do an abortion workup.
And Gregg, with the lab, you do a lot of work with livestock producers and specifically for this, cattle producers. And as we're talking about this data, are you always able to find the perfect answer for what caused this abortion?
No, and that's a great question, but abortion workups are very Well, they just cause a lot of heartache for the producer, for the veterinarian in the field, and for our diagnosticians, because on average, if you average everything over the years, for every abortion workup, we're going to actually be able to tell you 30% of the time exactly what it is. Now, we rule out a lot of stuff where we say we know it's not this, and this, and this, but a lot of times we can't definitively say what it is. This year it was actually less than 30%, and it does go up and down just depending on the year. And so, yeah, it's frustrating for everybody to have to try to work these samples up.
Is this you also asking producers to send you every calf that potentially aborted, or only if there's an issue they see?
Yeah, so it's hard to ask a producer and a veterinarian to really get crazy and start doing diagnostics on the first abortion, but certainly if there's more abortions than they typically have in a year, then I would always want to do diagnostics. The main thing is if you have an abortion and you're kind of worried that you might have more, it's important to try to save the tissues or that calf in case you have more, because the more samples that you can send to us, it increases the probability that we're going to find a definitive diagnosis. So I know I've read some things recently where the recommendation is to freeze the fetus. Actually, if the fetus is frozen, it actually prevents us from doing probably the most important test we can for an abortion workup. So we need to just keep them cool, either in an ice chest with ice or ice packs or an old refrigerator or something, just in case they need to send those samples in later.
Is there also the possibility of their local veterinarian doing like a necropsy and collecting those samples so they don't have to keep the whole calf?
Yeah, so especially if they're going to try to ship or try to send us samples to use for diagnostics, the best thing to do is have the veterinarian do a necropsy on the fetus, let them collect the tissues that are appropriate for abortions, because there are certain tissues that are meaningless. The veterinarian knows exactly what tissues to send and how to send them, whether it's fresh or whether it's in formaldehyde or whatever. So that's the best thing. If you have an abortion, get a veterinarian involved, talk about the situation, have them collect the samples and submit to us for diagnostics.
Gregg, if people want to learn more about your lab or your testing, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can either call us at 866-512-5650, or we've got a lot of things on our website that's at ksvdl.org. And then the other thing is we actually have a YouTube channel where we have lots of videos, short videos for both producers and veterinarians. Just Google KSVDL YouTube channel and it'll pop up there too.
Gregg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Nope, thanks for the invitation.
That was veterinarian in K-State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. The Kansas dairy industry is showing sustained growth in terms of milk production. However, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says the dairy herds increased in size in 2025, but total number of dairy farms decreased, something he expects to continue in 2026 and beyond.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers as where we're headed in 2026 in terms of animal numbers here in the state, as well as a little bit of some insight into how we're going to end up 2025. As we look at the numbers being published by USDA for the end of November, we're going to see a significant increase in the total number of dairy cows in the state of Kansas in 2025. Looks like when the December numbers come out here in a few weeks, we'll probably see an increase of about 45 to 50,000 head of dairy cattle in the state just during 2025. This will represent the largest increase that we have ever seen year over year here in this state, and will have a dramatic impact on our industry as we move forward. as we would expect that we would maintain these numbers as we move into 2026 and beyond, and likely see those numbers continue to grow. So as we think about our total milk supply here in Kansas and the number of farms that are involved, in 2025, we're likely to slip under 125 dairy farms here in the state of Kansas, those that have licenses to ship milk into the dairy industry, and we would expect that we will continue to see a slight decline in that number as we move into 2026. However, when we look at total milk production here in the state of Kansas, we'll see that probably grow by about 25% as we move into 2026. And as we look at the type of farms that we're seeing across the state, that also indicates a change in our state and in our industry. As we think about the central order here in Kansas and the relationship of the farms to central order marketings, there's been a dramatic change over the years here in Kansas. In the October milk marketing numbers, it was indicated that in the state of Kansas, even though we had just over 125 dairy farms, 23 of those dairy farms pooled 89% of the total milk pooled on the order in October of 2025. So as we think about how that relates to our industry, we have fewer dairy farms in the state of Kansas, and those dairy farms have grown in size as far as total number of cows per farm. We expect to see that number increase as we see fewer farms but larger number of cows per farm as we move into the near future for sure, and probably beyond as well. So for our Kansas dairy industry, many changes occurred in 2025 in terms of cow numbers and total milk production, and those issues and challenges will continue into 2026 as we see our industry grow closer and closer to a top 10 dairy state in the United States. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, this reminder, Kansas State University's 36th Annual Swine Profitability Conference, designed to address key factors influencing pork producer profitability and business decision-making, is set for February 3rd in Manhattan. Joel DeRushi, Swine Extension Specialist in K-State's Department of Animal Sciences and Industry, says that swine profitability is multifaceted, revolving around input costs and pork demand, as well as labor efficiency, herd health, and daily management decisions. K-State swine nutritionist Jordan Gebhardt says that this year's speakers plan to focus on opportunities and strategies to continue strengthening the profitability of swine production. The conference takes place at the Stanley Stout Center. Pre-registration is $25 per participant and is due by January 23rd. More information, including online registration, is available at ksuswine.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.